Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first panel of the World After the Pandemic conference. I'm really happy that you join us. I'm here with three colleagues in the basement of BISLA, and we are live streaming live from here to the whole world. For the first panel, that is also going to concern a little bit about us facing the reality of the pandemic and everything that it brought upon us. We'll have the first paper that it's concerned with societal and spatial mutations during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have here Mehmet Şahinler and Alican Taylan. Mehmet is a PhD candidate in sociology and researcher at Mimar Sinan University, and Alican is a faculty member at Pratt Institute School of Architecture in the US. So guys, I think the floor is yours, and good luck with the presentation.
All right, thank you, Matej. Well, hi everyone, and greetings from Istanbul. First of all, we would like to thank the organizing team for making this conference possible, and thank you all for being here. We are really glad to be here, and it's a great opportunity to be a part of this organization. We believe that thinking about the world after the pandemic right now is both necessary and fruitful. So now I would like to start as a sociologist by presenting our preliminary ideas and reflections about social and political mutations during and after the corona pandemic. Then Alican Taylan, as an architect, will talk about the spatial mutations. So when we first started to think about the world after the pandemic, we couldn't help but think about the world before the pandemic. That world was not really great altogether. So now, today, we are counting deaths and hoping to see flattening curves. But the world before the pandemic that appears so appealing today to many is a world where 25,000 die of hunger daily, and where we are on the edge of a climate breakdown and so forth. In that sense, we decided to elaborate on the pandemic in a different way. The question that concerns us became whether the pandemic, as a crisis, despite its deadly effects, might become an opportunity for positive change. Well, since the concept of crisis plays a crucial role in our understanding, let me just briefly explain how we see it. We argue that every crisis is societal, and we mean that in two different senses. Firstly, we claim that a crisis is societal because it's dependent on the social conditions in which the crisis is encountered. So, for example, a health crisis in the 14th century Europe will be quite different from our contemporary health crisis. Their impact will be different, their amplitude will be different, their spread will be different, and tools to prevent them will definitely not be the same. And secondly, we argue that a crisis in a subfield of the social is never limited to that subfield alone. In other words, a crisis is contagious, if you like. It spreads, for example, from economic field to social health, from ecology to politics, and so on. So it's never limited to a subfield alone. And that is to say that we think that a crisis is always dependent on the present social conditions on the one hand, and at the same time, it spreads between different social fields and thus inevitably becomes societal. Well, but why would it matter, right? What difference it makes when a crisis is understood as a social crisis? Well, we argue that a social crisis makes the inadequacy and the corruption of the present social formation highly visible. This is for us quite important. The force of habits, daily routines, and normality of the normal is torn open during a crisis. A social crisis, in that sense, is a moment of openness. Almost everything is possible during a social crisis. A simple example of that might be the October Revolution during the World War I. No one thought of a revolution was possible before the crisis that was caused by a pervasive war. And anyway, during a crisis, we claim that it becomes possible to face our usual and perpetual crisis, the way of life we name as normal. All of a sudden, we obtain the opportunity to look at the world through different lenses. Things that we used to do without questioning become open to debate, and things that were not even thinkable just a few days ago become possible. One can easily think of the trillions of dollars injected in Western economies during the corona crisis, while a few weeks earlier, the austerity policies were the only ruling idea of economic governance. So in that sense, we argue that a societal crisis provides a possibility of social change, but this doesn't necessarily mean that this possibility will be realized in a progressive way. Change is never one-sided or predetermined. Different kinds of change can emerge from every crisis, and the possibility range itself is extensive. Pre-crisis state of things can be strengthened. Control and exploitation can access levels that were never seen before. But the pre-normal can also be destroyed. Its problematic aspects can be seen and rejected. Alternative ways of life can be thought of. We can actually see how extensive this difference in kinds of social change can be by briefly looking at two historical examples. One of them can be the plague in the 14th century Europe. So the plague caused, as is well known, a rapid decline in population. Almost a third of the population in Europe was dead. And as a result, caused wages to increase and created a more humane life for the lower castes of society. It also caused, as we could see in the Boccaccio quote earlier, I'm not sure if you could see it in the presentation, that the plague caused a significant change in customs and traditions. On the other hand, as a counterexample, we can look at the smallpox pandemic in South America. Well, when the Europeans brought smallpox to native societies of Latin America, there was actually no decline of inequalities in the societies that were affected by smallpox. Quite on the contrary, actually, smallpox accelerated the downfall of several native civilizations, and at the same time, it created a blood-stained source of wealth for European monarchy. However, we think that the virus does not only create social and political change. We can also talk about spatial mutations, and my colleague Alican Taylan will now talk about this.
All right, thank you, Memo. And thank you for the organizers to organize this panel. It's great to be here. We think that the virus put us in an exceptional spatial organization as a society, if we may say. One that we will perhaps not live through again anytime soon. Over 1 billion people went or are going through a lockdown or so forth. And the situation made visible a trend in the way we inhabit the city. We would argue that this trend was started with digitization decades earlier, and that it only became very vivid when we actually all couldn't get out of our houses. So what I'm referring to is this total merging of places of work and leisure, of socializing and family spaces, of cultural and functional spaces. As recently as the 1970s, philosopher Michel Foucault wrote about the impossibility of this merging. It seemed to him that, at least for the society of his time, these dualities would always remain, that they were unchangeable. I'm referring to Foucault's text of Other Spaces, where he presented his concept of heterotopias. On a different note, in his retroactive manifesto, the architect Rem Koolhaas presented through case studies the effects of mechanization on the city of New York, so modernity. He observed that the implementation of elevators into commercial and residential buildings created this effect of verticalizing the urban sprawl and the spaces of work, while creating completely disjoint spatial linkages, stacks of floors with different functions in them. So you can have a business in one floor and another business on the other, and they don't have to be the same at all. So this space shift, the spatial shift that we're undergoing with digitization is actually even more radical. So sometimes rooms that are thousands of kilometers apart get connected via cameras, speakers, and interfaces, and they generate multiple networks of interconnected rooms in a rhizomatic way, as Deleuze would call it. With lockdowns everywhere around the globe, the long research and speculation around an architecture of the virtual then found itself a fertile ground for experimentation, we can say. But to advance that, the COVID-19 pandemic created a magically sustainable spatial model for the future would be very forgetful of space's complex relationship with production. As a matter of fact, spaces of production have only undergone minor cosmetic technological changes, we could argue, since the Industrial Revolution. For example, the early 20th century Ford's factory worker and today's Foxconn workers work in relatively similar spaces. In that regard, we might think that this setup is not to change anytime soon, on one hand. On the other hand, however, we can also see that this rhizomatic division of digitalized space is also affecting spaces of material production. One of the clearest examples of this might be Amazon's platform called Mechanical Turk. This website got its name from a 18th century Austrian pseudo chess machine that pretends it can play chess while it is actually operated by a puppeteer, by a human inside the machine. And this platform is aimed at providing on-computer jobs and services in different scales and forms. So if you're an employer, you can go online and ask, oh, could you translate this article for me? And someone somewhere in the world will maybe pick the job up and do it. So ranging from short text editings and organizing hundreds of Photoshop files, it could be anything. Employers can offer jobs to freelancing people that they will actually never see, and without being bound to any kind of regulation or restriction on wages and working conditions. So in a similar fashion, during this pandemic, we can observe a tendency in it where business owners lock people at home and create a pervasive working model that pushes workers to uncertainty without providing them with any kind of foreseeable future. But until now, we've spoken about the possibility of change. However, we also need to focus on other factors that challenge this possibility. One of these factors can be called resilience, or to make it more appropriate in this context, immunity. That is the immunity of our understanding of life, the immunity of our semantic, of our meaning structures, our experiences and how we assign meaning to them, either by customs, traditions, social norms, or by novel practices, all play a critical role in the way we become subjects. So we tend to somehow resist against information that proves our existing way of assigning meaning to life might be false or fake. This immunity can be observed in different levels, both in our daily lives and in historical events. As an example of historical events, the Europeans who sailed to Africa in the 15th century, naming the African statues they found there as fetishes, instead of facing the fact that there are other ways of self-expression and social communication, is a useful illustration of this mechanism. In the same way, climate change deniers who, against all scientific data, keep defending a business as usual model are another clear example illustrating the concept of immunity today. But that is how immunity works. It hides the truth, it covers up the possibility of an alternative. So when it comes to the coronavirus, we are up against a similar immunity. The existing social formation tries to deflect this crisis and reject any kind of responsibility and present it as a merely biological health crisis. And so people who they're so eagerly wanting to go back to their quote unquote normal life, they accept that. And it is quite obvious that the corona crisis is not a mere health crisis, though. It is affecting the vulnerable or fragile lives much more. It made our pre-existing inequalities more vivid than ever, and our pre-existing and usual crisis became much more visible. It's all out there in the open, but many of us will have a certain immunity against those facts, or so we argue. These were some preliminary ideas. And thank you for listening. And it's perhaps too early to draw conclusions, but as a final note, we want to emphasize that whatever the social conditions are, whatever the possibility of change and factors against it are, the virus itself cannot force social change. the virus is just an external agent that can remind us about the possibility or the necessity of social change. Hence, maybe the most important critical questions that we need to answer today together is who or which group will be the agent of change in this process. And there's a great difference between a top-down change coming from the already ruling classes as a certain grace from top down, and a change that is forced radically from below. Sadly, again, it is too early to have an answer to those questions, but we think it's a good opportunity, platforms like this, to start asking them and thinking. Thank you for listening. Our presentation is done over here, up, and I might maybe stop the share.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We'll now try to also unmute Mehmet. So now there is a space. We have around 5-7 minutes to answer any questions. So if there are anybody from the audience that wishes to ask a question at the Zoom, just feel free to raise your hand. So we have already one raised hand. Oh no, we have a clap. And also for those that are watching live stream, I'm just reminding them that they might join the questions through Slido and putting down the hashtag pandemic. We have also no questions there, so.
It was all clear. Okay.
Oh no, we have Noemi, so I will give her space now to ask her question.
Sound okay.
Noemi?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. So you rightly point out that our old normal was in fact not normal at all. So I was wondering whether you would say that we already lived in a state of crisis and that the pandemic only brought that to light. That is, the pandemic didn't cause the crisis. It just shows that our lives are what they are, for what they were. Or would you rather say that the pandemic is a new crisis on top of an existing crisis, which creates an even worse crisis? I was wondering what your view is about that.
Yeah.
Interesting question. You want to jump in, Memo, or I can just say a few words and maybe you want to say something?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the crisis displaced the other crisis, and so there's a displacement instead of a juxtaposition or a renewal complete. I would think. So by completely changing our ways of life, or the way of life of many people at least, it made us realize also that what we thought was normal, we were all in our lives going on like a train going fast, right? And so it just stops, and we realize that the old normal is actually not normal at all, and it's a good time for actually thinking of a change in society.
Yeah, I might just add, yeah, that was the main point of our presentation. So we were focusing on the problematic aspects of the old normal. But I think I can say that we think the new crisis caused by the coronavirus, it doesn't just displace it. I don't think it displaced it, but it just added on top of it, if you like. So it made the previous crisis much more visible. And so it also caused an openness, right? That was one of the most important aspects for us. So now the crisis that we lived in and we called normal and we saw as natural in a sense is torn open, and we can, at least most of us are open to new ideas, new ways of life, new ways of assigning meaning to life. So that was the most important point for us, I guess.
And I think that the notion of normality actually defines the notion of crisis at the same time. I just took another look at a book yesterday by Samuel Butler. It's called Erewhon, and it's an anagram for nowhere. It's the story of a man who goes into another society and discovers that all the rules, the normal rules in it, are completely topsy-turvy and upside down. So ill people are treated as criminals, and criminals are treated as sick people. And it's this very funny situation where, and with a lot of humor, where the normal is completely torn apart, and the ensuing dealing with reality also changes completely, while we see elements of familiarity in it. Or you can also think of the, I can't remember the name. I think it was a Truffaut film where the eating order is completely changed, where in a bourgeois house, people go and take a shit while eating together and talk. And they go to the bathroom saying, sorry, I have to go. And they go eat a hamburger in the bathroom all by themselves. This questioning of the normal is fascinating.
We have one more question. I will now share just for a second the screen. It's at the Slido, so we have, I will start with the first one. So if you have any thoughts on the effects of the social and spatial changes on well-being, disruption to our normal lives, that's inadequacies, creates whether it can create new modes of illness. And yeah, the person that is asking is also asking about, they're thinking especially about mental and emotional difficulties. So can you respond to this?
Yeah, maybe Alican would like to start.
Sure, I mean, I think the question is touching upon what we were referring to in the presentation as it's making vulnerable lives even more vulnerable, right, in a way, and it's making it harder for any part of society that is not a dominant part, all kinds of minorities in that sense, more difficult than it is. So in that change, there is always a hope for change and so forth. But obviously the crisis is so pervasive in our daily lives that it's not affecting everyone in the same way. And for sure, it's making anyone who's going through some kind of illness more complicated.
Yeah, and what we wanted to point out is that I think mostly the crisis, of course, causes problems in the well-being of all of us. No one likes to be locked down in their houses. No one likes to be stay immobile throughout the day, and no one wants to be alone. But what we wanted to point out is that even before this crisis, which is acknowledged by the whole world now, there were many people dying out of hunger, suffering from mental illnesses, suffering from preventable diseases, suffering from the effects of climate change, unfair policies, and so on. The list can go on forever. So what we wanted to point out is not the problems caused by the new crisis, but we wanted to show that this crisis might be an opportunity for change, because our old way of life was really problematic. Our usual and perpetual crisis, and mostly unacknowledged crisis, was totally problematic.
Thank you for your responses. Now I think it's my space to also thank you for your presentation. So we can give a round of applause to our two presenters. And we will continue now with Noemi. I will ask her to start her video. And meanwhile, while she's getting on, I will do a short introduction. So Noemi was born and raised in a small countryside in northern Italy, but lived and studied in London for the past 9 years. She's a graduate teaching assistant at King's College London and Birkbeck, where she recently completed a PhD in political philosophy, and her research centers around liberalism, multiculturalism, and autonomy, with a particular focus on vulnerable individuals. And she's going to be talking about, as you can already see on the screen, learning from the pandemic through a solidaristic approach. So, floor is yours, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All right. Okay. So before I start, I just want to thank the conference organizers for this timely event, and Matej for chairing this session, and of course my co-panelists and everyone who is attending today. So as you can see from the very first slide of my presentation, I'm going to talk about a solidaristic approach to public health. So what I'm gonna do is I will introduce you to some of the things that Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, has to say about the COVID-19 pandemic, and tell you why I think that he's wrong, at least in some respects. So Agamben started writing on COVID-19 as soon as the crisis hit Europe, and in particular Italy, where he's based. And you can find his reflections online. They're in Italian, but have been translated in English and perhaps in other languages as well. He argues that the pandemic has altered the very fabric of our societies, potentially changing them forever. Now, quite annoyingly, at least for me, it doesn't believe that the virus is actually a threat. I mean, it refers to the pandemic as an invention or as a risk that cannot be possibly specified. So what is concerning about the pandemic, real or imagined for him, are not its associated health risks, but the way both individuals and states have reacted to the virus itself. So let me say something about Agamben's worries. There are two main worries, I think. The first one is that the pandemic constitutes an opportunity for governments to tighten their coercive control over citizens, creating the conditions for a state of exception, what he calls a state of exception, that could persist indefinitely. So if you're familiar with Agamben's work, he talked about the state of exception in a book that he published at the beginning of I think it was like 2005. The state of exception entails, among other things, restrictions on individual freedoms, such as freedom of movement and freedom of association, which is for Agamben a fundamental prerequisite for political freedom. The second worry that Agamben talks about is a degeneration of the relationships between individuals who are now afraid of any contact with others. And this for him is even worse than the loss of freedom itself. And of course, it is related to the first worry that I just talked about. Because of social distancing measures, individuals now see others only as potential untori. Untori is an Italian word that roughly translates as anointers or plague spreaders. It has been around for a very long time, I think at least since the Black Death in the 14th century, and has been used a lot in Italian literature, for instance, and history in the 17th and 18th century, where there were various pandemics affecting the Italian peninsula. So as a consequence of state-imposed restrictions and individual fears, a combination of both, face-to-face contacts are being replaced with virtual ones, and political discussion and activity are stifled. Now, again, if you're familiar with what Agamben is saying these days, it's very much against, for instance, online teaching, and I suspect it would be against like an online conference like this one, because he believes that coming together to talk about things, not only politics, but stuff in general, creates some sort of community and allows people to become political agents. While nowadays, he believes that individuals no longer believe in anything apart from what he calls bare life, which is basically mere physical survival. So individuals are only worried about their own survival, and thus they become a passive and rarefied mass, ready to subject itself to the tyrannical power of a Leviathan. Now, what should we make of Agamben's view? I said at the beginning that I don't believe that Agamben has good reasons to say that the pandemic is an invention. But of course, that's more a matter of science than philosophy. So I'm going to focus on something else instead. And I think that Agamben raises some important criticisms against a particular way of responding to the health crisis, a way that is based on interpersonal distrust and the exceptional exercise of unchecked state power. But I also think that it misses an important implication of living in a society in which individuals can anoint others. And this is the acknowledgement each of us, ourselves as well as others, can potentially spread the infection. So each of us is a potential untore. We're both vulnerable and the source of others' people's vulnerability. I don't have much time to go into this in any detail, but let me just say that I think that vulnerability is both an ontological and a relational concept. It refers to the capacity to suffer harm shared by all human beings. Well, I mean, we can be harmed in virtue of our very humanity, and that's why I think it is an ontological concept. But while everyone can be harmed, some individuals and groups are more susceptible to harm than others. And this is why I think that vulnerability is a relational or situational concept. And I also think that a focus on vulnerability shows that it is possible to conceive of social distancing as an act of solidarity, which stems from the recognition of both our ontological and relational vulnerability. So distancing oneself from others is not just a way to protect oneself. It's not just a means to self-protection. It is a way to protect others. And by extension, it is also a way to protect meaningful relationships with others. And this, of course, goes against Agamben's idea that individuals now only care about their life, their survival, and are ready to sacrifice everything for it, even their most cherished relationships. Another thing that I'm unhappy about is that Agamben talks a very particular freedom, which is freedom from interference mainly, and it is only the freedom of those who have little to fear from the virus or are willing to risk being infected. It is not the freedom of vulnerable people or of those who are not vulnerable but live or work with vulnerable individuals. And in my view, focusing on the freedom to move around and meet in person to talk politics disregards the reality of those with already limited mobility, fragile health, care commitments, and those who are most at risk of harm in times of crisis. I mean, in a way, it narrows political concern to include only the healthy, able-bodied, and socially privileged. And I think that's very problematic. So let me briefly conclude by saying that, again, I believe that Agamben has a point when he worries about a permanent extension of the state of exception brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. And it is true that social distancing measures can make political activity more difficult and reduce individual freedom to a certain extent. And so they need a strong justification to be put in place. But I also believe that such justification can be offered by an acknowledgement that we are all vulnerable and some people are more vulnerable than others. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that all measures are fine. They must be proportionate to the threat, they must be limited in time, they must be transparent, and so on. But there is a justification there if we are willing to find it. So I believe that individuals should remain vigilant about what's happening, and they should hold government agencies accountable for what they do. But we should also take responsibility for our actions and accept that some limitations to our freedom may be necessary to protect others as well as ourselves. So sacrifices may be needed, but they should be less hard to make if they are done in the spirit of solidarity instead of mere self-interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insightful presentation and for your talk. As before, it's very similar. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand in the Zoom, or if you are on the live stream, you might join the questions through Slido and just using #pandemic. We might give it a few seconds because it takes time oh, we have already 2 questions. So, okay, we'll start with Orwa, and I will giving him now space to talk.
Yeah. Hi, Naomi, thank you for the presentation. It was great. I just have a question about, you speak of a solidaristic approach, and one of the things that I've been thinking about throughout the pandemic is that there's a generalized kind of condition of quarantine and lockdown for the majority of us. And the conditions of quarantine and lockdown are very visible. So you find the rich 1%, etc., enjoying a quarantine life in mansions and in the sun and private islands or whatever. But the majority of us are sitting in 1-room or 2-room apartments and unable to even see the sun for large periods of time. What effect do you think that these kind of generalized conditions would have on a solidaristic approach to the pandemic? Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. That's a very good question. So, well, one thing that I haven't focused on, but I believe is important to stress is that, of course, the pandemic and its related restrictive measures have a different impact on different people. So, as you mentioned, there are some people who can spend their time in their mansions, and there are other people who live in very small apartments or rooms. But also think about people who would prefer not to quarantine, not because they don't believe that the virus exists, but because for them it is a problem not to be able to go to work. So I think there are lots of different vulnerabilities in place there. And so when I said that restrictive measures should be justified, of course, I mean that might also mean taking into consideration the fact that quarantine affects different people differently, and that many people can lose their jobs or their livelihood, or they can become unable to pay their rent if they don't go to work. And so they become vulnerable as well. So there's a sense in which we shouldn't only focus on vulnerable people in terms of people who are vulnerable in health because they have health conditions, but vulnerable people in general. So yeah, I agree with you. It completely makes a huge difference where you are and what your conditions are.
Okay, we have a second question from Mehmet. We'll try to unmute him.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. It was fascinating. I was just wondering, and this is not a really serious question. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on Agamben's relationship with the people who are protesting against the lockdowns in the USA, for example? It seems like his social heroes are them right now, right? Because they don't want to be locked down. They want messages. They want haircuts. They want to go out. They don't accept the bare life. So would you think that Agamben would agree with those people? And just a follow-up, if I may, from the previous question. I think it's an important question to think about when you are speaking about solidarity. Is a solidarity between the ruling classes and the exploited and the, I don't know, forced to work people who are forced to work? Is a solidarity between them possible? Is it really possible? Oh yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mehmet. So on the first point, I think that Agamben would be sympathetic towards the cause of the people who are protesting in the US because they want to go about their lives as usual. Although, of course, Agamben has a more profound reason as to why we should resist limitations on our freedom. And it's not just about going to restaurants or having a haircut. It's more about being able to meet in person with others and talk politics. So this is what he's worried about. So I guess he thinks that if you cannot go to university, if you cannot go to cafes, you cannot talk to other people, you cannot resist the government. And of course, in a situation in which we're in lockdown, protesting itself becomes much more difficult because technically we can't go out in the streets and protest. So that's another thing that we have to be, careful about, because I guess Agamben would say, well, there's no way for us to protest, so we are not able to contest the government, and so the government can do whatever it wants, and we enter into a permanent state of exception. About the second point on solidarity, I don't know, I'm sure you've heard about what Dominic Cummings has done in the UK recently. So you have a government top advisor breaching quarantine rules to do whatever he wants to do. And there's a huge discussion going on here about how that really breaks solidarity between people, because of course it is already more difficult for people who are less fortunate to adhere to norms of social distancing. And then they see that there are some people that in virtue of their privilege can do whatever they want, or at the very least, they can really have a better life. So I think it is really important that to create that kind of solidarity, everyone should be on board. And I also realize that that's difficult, so maybe it's never going to happen that everyone is on board. But thank you, those were really good questions.
Yeah, we have another question from Orban.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Matej. And just to the point about Dominic Cummings, in a way, do you think that this kind of blatant and obvious imbalance in power and abuse of power really can contribute to some kind of working class solidarity in a way? I know you mentioned it might not be the best in terms of solidarity towards the pandemic and the general health environment, but when this power is abused and it's very blatant and obvious to everyone, and most people realize that the majority of us are sitting in a place where we don't even have the choice to, we don't even have the power to be able to abuse it in the first place. Thanks.
Thank you. So yes, I think in a way it can produce that kind of, or it can encourage that kind of solidarity, because then people who have been respecting the lockdown now can say, well, we made sacrifices and you didn't, so what makes you different from us? And you can kind of see yourself as part of a group that respected the rules in opposition to people who didn't. But I think, as some of my co-panelists will be talking about later, the role of the media is also something that we should think about, and also, so the way in which these things are presented, and also how the politicians, for instance, are defending Dominic Cummings. So in a way that also breaks solidarity between people of the same social group. But there is a potential there, I agree with that. Thank you.
I see no further questions, so it's also my space to thank you so much for your presentation and for your paper. It was very interesting to read, so I think we can give a round of applause to Noemi, and we can continue straight to Deniz and Simon. I will now ask them to turn on their cameras. Perfect. And also unmute you. Okay, so just a brief intro before you start your presentation. Simon is a fourth-year PhD student in philosophy at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. And before moving to the US, Simon obtained his bachelor degree in computer science and philosophy in UK and Germany. Simon's current research focus focuses on issues related to risk and uncertainty in political decision making. And Deniz is a student at the University of Hamburg, and he studied philosophy and mathematics, focusing on philosophy of science, mathematics, logic, and discrete mathematics. So, guys, I think the floor is yours, so you can take it from here, and all the good luck, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, thanks everyone for showing up, albeit only virtually, and thanks to the organizers for organizing this conference. We are very glad to be here. So I'll start by just giving a quick overview of what we are going to talk about in the next 10 minutes or so. We'll start by explaining what epidemiological models for COVID-19 are, emphasizing that while they're useful in political decision-making, they are also quite inaccurate in general. We will then argue that it would be desirable if there was an awareness of the kind of epistemic limitations of these models in the public. But unfortunately, for at least two reasons, we are a bit skeptical whether there is such an awareness. First, the uncertainties are not reliably communicated in the media. And second, there is a certain public image of mathematics and maybe science in general, which is an obstacle on the path towards a more enlightened understanding of what these models can really tell us. And we'll conclude by making some suggestions of how we might improve in general on the public dissemination of these kind of scientific findings in the future. Okay, so just to make sure that we are all on the same page, epidemiological models for COVID-19 are scientific tools which predict the spread of the disease in various scenarios. So you can basically ask a model a question, sometimes something like how many people will die of COVID-19 by a particular date in the United States if we go into lockdown or if we don't do anything, and the model will give you some number. So as you might imagine, this is quite useful in policymaking to have these kind of answers from scientific models. And so it's no surprise that they are widely relied upon in policymaking. One prominent example of that is the UK, where modeling results from Imperial College really changed the decision of the government of how to deal with this crisis. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that those models are in general not very accurate if you look at the specific numbers that they forecast. And it's relatively easy to see that they have to be quite inaccurate on average. So first of all, there are many of these models and they make quite different predictions. So it just cannot be true that all of them are very accurate. Many of them have to be quite wrong. And second, predicting these infectious diseases, in particular at very early stages where we don't know crucial parameters like how contagious a disease is, just a very hard problem. While they are in general quite inaccurate in the predictions they make, we want to stress that we think they are nevertheless useful for guiding action. We are not against the use of these models. In particular, they can often give us some kind of confidence intervals where they say, well, the actual number of deaths will probably lie within a certain spectrum of maybe 40,000 to 150,000 in a particular country if you go into lockdown. If you don't do anything, that the spectrum is shifted upwards by a lot. And that's already useful information for policymaking. Nevertheless, we think it would be desirable if the public was aware of the inaccuracy of these models. So here are two reasons why we think that would be desirable. First, it's important to enable the public to hold politicians accountable. So it's easy for politicians to misuse these modeling predictions to justify their policies. Because usually, as I emphasized, it's not too hard to find some model which will say that your policy is a good idea. So if we let politicians get away with just cherry picking the model that kind of confirms their policy, then that's an issue. They might get away with taking policies for other reasons and then appearing to be guided by evidence. And just as an aside, the Trump administration has been accused of engaging in that behavior by using a particular model which was fairly optimistic, which predicted a relatively low number of people who would pass away from COVID-19. The second reason why we think it would be desirable if the public was aware of the limits of these models is that if people get overconfident in these predictions, then it's foreseeable that they will also be quite disappointed and maybe start distrusting experts a lot more when they see that the actual numbers turn out to be very different from what they heard the scientists were saying. And we think that a sort of general distrust in experts, while sometimes healthy, can also become dangerous because people might then ignore advice from experts, which makes a lot of sense, like washing your hands, for instance. So why we think it would be desirable if there was awareness of these limitations. We suspect that maybe at least some part of the population might not have the necessary awareness. So just one sort of preliminary thing we looked at was we looked at 30 news articles, and we found that about a third of them just reported a sort of precise estimate of a model without saying that the model maybe also said, there's a very large confidence interval and this prediction is very uncertain. So this is misleading. And it doesn't do a good job of communicating to the public what the epistemic status of these results is. Okay, and with that, I will hand over to Deniz.
Perfect. Could you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
Great.
I'm trying to. Okay, I hope that worked.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay. Can you see the presentations?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, and of course there are different parts where one could try to change society. One might argue that we need to change media, but we wanted to focus on mathematics education. And there is a general point we want to make as well, and this is there's an ethical or philosophical component to mathematics education. And Paul Ernest, the founder of the Journal for Philosophy of Mathematics Education, stressed it quite early. And he said the reason for that is while math is a source of good widely, there are problems of collateral damage. And one source of this harmful part of mathematics is our wrong perception of math. So in this quote, he stresses things like that math is difficult, largely masculine, inaccessible, and just for super intelligent beings. And from there, some authority comes. And I mean, some part there's problematic that masculinity is linked to authority is problematic in its own right, but it keeps, we have to observe that we give authority to mathematicians while disengaging people to look at mathematical methods. And implicitly by being cold, abstract, or ultra-rational, we project normative components there without problematizing modeling decisions, for instance. And we say we need a culture of critical appreciation for mathematical or scientific tools. And just appreciation is problematic as it makes us vulnerable to pseudoscience. And scientists do not have a political mandate, and sometimes they tend to overestimate their realm of expertise. But on the other side, without appreciation, there is a misreading of relativistic philosophical positions in general. So equal airtime for a climate scientist and a change denier is an example. Not all positions are equal, even if we doubt something like absolute truth, but it's often phrased like that in debates. Yeah, and we say there is actually a tradition in mathematics education that could help achieving this, and this is the SGE tradition. And just to start with a little story, we are no historians, so we cannot really tell you much about that, but in the folders of the Entnazifizierung in Germany, denazification, there is a member of the Nationalsozialistische Lehrerbund who was counted as part of the resistance. And the reason for that was not that he throws stones at tanks or something like that. The reason for that was his sharpening of critical judgment in his physics and mathematics education. And I mean, just as a story, this is quite astonishing. And when we look at his method, this SGE method, he always said we have to start with a phenomenon. So just look at something in the real world that's interesting. And COVID-19 is such a phenomenon. And his method had always 3 parts, so SGE, Sokratisch, Socratic, generic, and exemplarisch. And Socratic means that he encouraged students to work in groups. So the teacher was just a mentor guiding such groups and is not passing on knowledge to the others. Genetic just means that we follow the context of discovery. So not directly to the result, but looking at the methods to the way there. And exemplarisch just means that we focus on the most important or pressing aspects of a phenomenon. And so we argue that this COVID-19 situation motivates to implement hands-on modeling experiences in high school or in mathematics education. And we say that this is helping to appreciate science, since we see that stuff doesn't come out of thin air, while showing that we cannot blindly trust every number, that there are methodological issues. So somehow our conclusion is that we have to combine tools and research methods with like a humanistic point of view about this, or a philosophy of science view, if you want to phrase it that way. Okay, so it remains to thank you for your attention. And we still have some time for questions.
Yeah, so if you stop sharing your screen, or I can stop it.
Sure, perfect.
Okay. Okay. We have already one question from Alican. Just give me a sec to find him, and I will give him a space to talk.
Great. Thank you guys for the presentation. I have a question about, there was this media moment, perhaps like at the very beginning, early March or so, and I was following it in the French media, but on television, but it was also other places. There was this modeling moment where the curve became very mediatized. Right? There was the idea of the curve. So I saw a video of a French politician, I think it was the health minister or something, and he went on television and he drew this curve saying, oh, it's going to go up, but then it's going to go down. And what we're trying to do is to try to minimize this curves, to elongate the curve, basically, so that we don't saturate hospitals, etc. And it was very well received in the public, because it was a kind of very simple explanation. Did you, as like you have experience in this field, but did you feel like that was a right moment and a great insight, or is this just a simple, like, is it 101, the first thing you know about epidemiological modeling?
So Simon, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start saying a few things. So, I mean, from my perspective, so I've seen this general image of the curve, and the slogan flattening the curve, I think has been sort of widespread in a variety of countries, not only English-speaking countries, by the way. So that I agree that this was a sort of pervasive image. And I thought that was actually an example of good science communication, because it was aimed at the general public, right? Everyone should understand that the idea of these policies are to delay how fast people get infected, so that our healthcare systems do not get overwhelmed and sort of people get the disease one after the other. And I thought the way it was communicated was completely appropriate, suggesting that we know exactly how the curve will look in various scenarios. That would have been misleading, but at least in the sort of video clips that I've seen, that had not happened. What was said was, this is the general shape of the curve, and we need to stretch it in a certain way. Yeah.
Anything else to add? Okay. If anybody has a question, feel free to raise your hand. We have Noemi, so I will give her a space.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. So you rightly point out that the best way to avoid having a public that is overconfident and uncritical towards epidemiological models is to educate people to critically appreciate scientific inquiry. I was wondering whether you think that would be enough. I mean, after all, people may keep seeing what they want to see in scientific models. So the problem may not be that they are unable to understand these models, but that they tend to interpret them in certain ways. I'm thinking here of confirmation bias and stuff like that. I was wondering if you have a view on this. Thank you.
So maybe I will answer this one and you can add something. You are totally right that this will not solve everything. And but at least like my naive hope would be that these bias, to understand these kind of biases is part of understanding the scientific methods. And maybe this can help if a person is trained to be aware of the biases and always ask whether one of such biases applies. So this would be just a hope that stressing the scientific method could be helpful there, but apparently this is not the whole part of the solution to teach epidemiological modeling. So even not the solution for this very particular question.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the Zoom call? Or also, if you are on the live stream, you can ask through Slido and #pandemic. If there are no other questions, I might use the privilege of moderator to ask a question myself. I had one question regarding, especially because now there is a lot of talk about reducing the content in the classes and kind of rather trying to go down and or even incorporate blended learning into our regular learning. So how would you justify kind of adding some other kind of mathematical classes, or whether it can be possible to kind of, for example, incorporate it into classes for all two other subjects?
So maybe I will start. I guess there's a general shift in education and in mathematical education in particular to go away from knowledge to competences. And it's a little fuzzy to grab this exactly. So if this was the question, so I guess we would need to erase some part of the general curriculum and shift more towards this competencies approach. And I guess this is also something that happens like by default when we look into curricula 50, 60 years ago. Memorization was a key topic when, at least in Germany. My parents weren't in Germany then, but those who were needed to memorize lists of facts, and that was something we don't have anymore as we have the internet always there. So the hope is that scientific literacy might have more space as we have less need to know facts because we can look them up.
Yeah, and just as a small addendum to that, one can, of course, ask whether all the things that are currently done in math classes are worth doing. So, I mean, just to give an example to maybe make this a bit more concrete, nowadays it's very common that students learn a particular kind of recipe to calculate something, and then what they do is they apply the recipe over and over again to like word problems where they have to extract the parameters out of a text. But I mean, instead you could say, well, some of the time maybe they are trained, they try to figure out whether actually the recipe is the right recipe for the given problem in the real world, which would be very much the kind of thing that Deniz and I would like to see more in the classroom. So here you could just replace existing content with maybe a slightly different approach.
Okay, we have one more last question from Mehmet, and then we'll move to the next presentation. So Mehmet.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was fascinating. I was just wondering about the feasibility of what you are suggesting, because when you start to add on topics to the curriculum, mathematical curriculum at least, then you will have to teach the students about statistics. I don't know what many examples can be given. You can teach about the finance, economics, and you can teach them about the, I don't know, law maybe. So many aspects of our world are quite complex and hard to understand, and we normally just leave that part to the specialists, and we don't have the opportunity to critically appraise them. So what makes you think, although I'm quite sympathetic to your point, what makes you think that the epidemiological modeling would have the I don't know, would be one of the first things to add to the curriculum?
So maybe, so as in the question before, maybe we should have stressed more that it's not about getting up to the level of real research models with thousands of parameters that are fine-tuned, but just about getting like a first grasp on these topics. And the other point is, like, even in Wagenschein, the man we quoted, there's a phenomenon that even well-educated people are often not able to explain basic phenomena. So a physics major is not able to explain things you can observe every day, like the change of the moon in the different phases. And the other point is that this overstressing of recipes, as Simon stressed, makes children sometimes blind to see what that question is really about. So captain task is one example. You can try if you have a younger sibling or niece or something like that. When you give children a lot of information, like at a ship there are 7 sheep, 8 horses, blah, blah, blah. How old are you? Quite a lot of children are adding all numbers you gave them because they are just so trained to do that without looking for a second what they actually should do.
Yeah, and maybe also a second point to stress is that we think a lot could be achieved by actually not changing too much the content of what is taught, but more the method by which it is taught. So if the method like the SGE method was employed to teach similar content, not very sophisticated content, that might already help students to just appreciate the kind of process that a scientist goes through without necessarily understanding all the detailed considerations that someone who has worked for 20 years in epidemiology will consider.
Thank you so much. I think you all deserve a round of applause. Thank you for your presentation, and we are very happy that you joined our conference, and we are looking forward to reading your full paper. Okay, we will move now to the last presentation of this panel, which is done by Fitrilya. I will try to unmute you and ask you to start the video. Perfect. So before you share your screen, I will just give a very brief introduction, and then the floor is yours. Okay, Fitrilya is an assistant professor with station at the Universitas Gadjah, Mada, to teach philosophy of memory and trauma studies for MA students. She is also a philosophy blogger with pseudonym Philosophical Pimp. You can find her articles on Instagram with a username Philosophical Pimp. So floor is yours, and we are gonna go through a paper that is called Processing Traumatic Memories of COVID-19 Pandemic as a Cultural Trauma.
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to say hello to everyone, and I hope that you are all in good condition today in this most uncertain time. I'm going to present my paper. Actually, I changed the title itself into Remembering COVID-19 as Cultural Trauma. Cultural trauma is a transformation in the way we remember horrific event in order to have a longer term effect. Actually, this is a concept by Jeffrey C. Alexander, sociologist from Yale University. And something that must be noted on this concept of cultural trauma is that not all traumatic event turns to cultural trauma, but we can make traumatic event like this pandemic into cultural trauma. Even the traumatic event that nowadays is considered as cultural trauma that already changed the way people in the world think about the war, like the trauma on Holocaust itself. First, it's not considered, at the very first place, it's not considered as cultural trauma. It's not considered, you know, the Nazis, the Holocaust is not considered as crimes against humanity. It is only considered as Nazi's atrocity, war atrocity. So before I'm going more into theoretical explanation about cultural trauma, I'm trying to guess what's on our mind when we have all the news around when we have the World Health Organization finally announced that COVID-19 is a global pandemic. I'm sure that most people, even until today, are curious about medical science development. And also, most of us, including myself, are curious about the history of our global pandemics, the previous pandemics. So I'm trying to find the articles and books about history of our previous pandemics, and what I found from the historical writings, they have a formula like this: how it begins, and how long the pandemic take place, and then the death tolls, and finally, the historical narrative will be end with who found the vaccine or how the way to cope with the disease. But I guess from all of that formula in our historical writing about pandemic, I guess that there is something missing. We have not seen everything in full view from those three formula of history. There is one thing missing, and it is about the conflict inside the crisis. Like some of us or politicians refuse to follow medical experts' instruction. So in order to understand the conflict inside the crisis, we need to imagine like we are driving in the same vehicle, in one large vehicle that suddenly falls into a puddle and gets stuck in it. So the journey must stop. We are taught that the only way to get out this unwanted situation is by giving it a push. Together, all of the passengers, but each passenger has different character and not all want to get a push. You know what I mean? You can imagine this situations in our nowadays crisis. And I'm sure that conflict inside crisis happen in all pandemic in history, where some of us want to do quarantine, and some of us have propose some kind of anti-quarantine movement, even the politicians, even the government. So why those missing piece of the detail about the conflict inside the crisis? It matters for me. I mean, to make change, because it will help us to get a better view of our nowadays crisis and put it in the history. And then, since we have a better view of our nowadays crisis in history, that all the pandemics had actually conflict inside crisis, so we can draw unceasingly historical line, and we can, from those things, it will help to establish pandemic myth. Why then establishing pandemic myth is important? Because we learn from Benedict Anderson's in Imagine Communities that myth can unite a nation. And also we learn from Holocaust trauma that myth also can change our mental state. Same thing, I'm sure, will happen to prepare better mental state in facing pandemic. So if the pandemic myth is established, then we will have collective beliefs about pandemic, and also we have a collective memory of trauma. So what's actually behind trauma? Like I already said that. I read Mehmet and Alican paper, and I agree with them that that they mentioned that this crisis will lead into a conflict of interest, you know, in the aftermath, and there will be top-down change versus force from below. And let me paraphrase it as an opening of social arena. So I think we need to use this opening in the social arena to push innovation and change, to win this rumble, to make a culture that is mental ready for fight the pandemic in the future generations. And in order to make this culture shifting, to make a mental to make people change their mental state, that we need to get ready for the pandemic. We need to, when the pandemic struck, you know, that people will be, you know, believe in science and believe in what medical expert had said, that kind of things. So in order to create a culture of trauma, to make this traumatic event transformed into a collective trauma, then we must have to, there are some steps that we need to do. Like the first is claim making. We need to make claim. And as mentioned by Thompson, that the cultural construction of trauma begins with such a claim. And this first step becomes very important, not only as a curtain raiser, but also to prepare a powerful narrative foundation to ensure the successful of the whole process. And in powerful narrative foundation, we need to consider several things. First, we must state the nature of pain, what actually happened to the particular group and to the wider collectivity of which it is part. We must also state that the nature of victim, that will help define who are the protagonists and antagonists. If all this time, the history of the pandemic is only to write about human warfare against disease, this point of view needs to be modified. We must also state that in the fight against the virus, we also fight with another humans and their selfishness. Therefore, it would be crystal clear of who becomes the protagonist, while there are some people who block our effort to overcome the worst situation by becoming an antagonist. In the case of COVID-19 pandemic, those who feel pain and become victims are not only those who become patients, physicians, or medical practitioners, the families of patients who died, but are far more extensive. We must see through the conflict between those who follow quarantine procedure and try so hard to keep their body and soul together amid all the pressure with them who are anti-quarantine. We also know that there are a lot of people who are at risk of experiencing domestic violence and mental disorders during quarantine, but they still choose to do so. Their pain should not be erased from history. They might have track records of the bad experiences when doing quarantine on social media or on blog or something. This will help to compile the testimony from the victim to show that mental preparation is needed. Next, we must position the relation of trauma victims to the wider audience, so the wider audience can understand what actually the victims feel. And then the second thing that we must consider is the agent, and the agent must be the carrier groups. I'm borrowing from Max Weber's term. And Carrier groups are those who have a big influence on the process of meaning making in the social environment. The important thing to note is that they not only have a large influence, but their position can explain and relate to COVID-19. They can be from elites, from spiritual figures, public figures, and also people who fall into the category of victims of this pandemic. And then third, and the last one, we have Speech Act. The Speech Act, it is actually a theory from J.L. Austin. And then to make a Speech Act effective, we must pay attention to speakers, audience, and situations. If the speakers are determined and they are from carrier groups, then what needs to be considered is who the audiences are. This is important because the speaker must also be able to make a narrative construction that can bring the catharsis effect of the tragedy to the audience who are listening to it. Besides that, the place where we will deliver is also an important element. However, the situation is not just a matter of location, it is also about the right momentum. So I guess if we are considering from all of those kind of elements, we can make we can create a huge solidarity of people to get ready, of our future generations to get ready into to face pandemic if it will be happen again in uncertain futures. So yeah, I guess that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I will ask now people in the Zoom, and we have already first question from Mehmet. So if anybody else has a question, raise your hand. Or if you are on the live stream, I will just remind you that you can go to Slido and use #pandemic, and you can ask any questions. And I'm pretty sure we'll be happy to answer any of your questions. So Mehmet, floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Fitrilya. It was really nice to listen to you. Can you maybe just go back to your last slide? What's the one called "What's Behind Trauma"? Is it possible? Or is it, if it's hard?
Yes. Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. Wait. Okay, this one.
Yeah. So there you say, under the make claim and powerful narrative foundation, you have 3 points, right? State the nature of pain, nature of victim, and relating trauma victim to win their audiences. But I was wondering if I somehow think that someone should be held responsible to be able to turn collective trauma into cultural trauma, right? So in the example of the Holocaust, Nazis were to blame. But in this corona crisis, it's not as clear as the Holocaust example who's to blame. Well, if you ask me, the pre-crisis state of things and the ruling classes are to blame, and neoliberalism maybe. But I think it might be a good idea to add a point about the responsible group or responsible structure or whatever. So that wasn't a question, actually, just a comment maybe.
Well, yeah, I want to say something about who's to blame. Since my paper is aimed to, the cultural trauma in my paper is aimed to prepare for the next generations, for our next generations to have a better mental state. So I think who's to blame in this, or who's the antagonist? I would say that the people who do not listen to what medical experts say are the antagonist. Yeah, I guess that's.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions? If there is nothing, I have one question, and this is more about talking about the cultural drama and maybe its scale, as it is quite different from many, like you mentioned quite a few examples, but very few were where if you are like not limited by space that or any specific group, because this pandemic is kind of taking up almost on all of us, and it's kind of creating global drama. If you would consider this, or how it would maybe differ from other traumas, or whether we have any other experience that might be as global as this one.
I'm sorry, my connection is lost. Can you repeat that, Matej?
Yeah, sure. It's about the globality of this trauma, whether there was any maybe other traumatic experience that would be such a huge in scale and kind of such a universal around the globe.
In this pandemic?
Yeah, compared to like examples that you've given.
Okay. So I think that yes, I know it is really a hard task to make this pandemic as a cultural trauma, because there are so many things to because it is absolutely different than the Nazi, absolutely different than any other traumatic event, mostly about wars. But I think that we can take how the people who are in around the globe who are trying to do quarantine, to do quarantine, despite they're fighting their mental state, who actually maybe they do not want to live alone, they do not want to be left alone, they do not want to stay at home all the time, like it's longer time, but they keep doing it, they keep fighting it, and while on the other side there are also people who are trying to to force some kind of anti-quarantine. So I think if we can compile all of the news about how people against the anti-quarantine, I guess we can write a better history about the pandemic. So when we write a better history with a better formula, and we also provide some kind of some kind of an articles that is not too long to read and not too boring to read on the internet. So I think we can make this kind of change as great as we can turn traumatic event in wars into a cultural trauma. I don't know if it answered your question.
Yes, and I think we have a follow-up, so I will just use it to kind of, you can keep going. That we have a question whether it would be maybe easier to talk about collective experience of trauma, that everyone experience it in their own way, but collectively also. If you can see it, and maybe try to respond.
Yes, will it not be easier to talk about? True.
Yeah, so what do you think?
Okay, so can you show it again? I mean, my connection is not that really good. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, it's just it's building on my question about whether it would not be easier to talk about collective experience of trauma in which everyone experienced it in their own way, but collectively also. And this might be very specific to this pandemic, which is that we are kind of experiencing it all alone in our own way, in our homes or in our places that we got stuck, but we are also kind of experiencing it collectively.
Yes, so you know how to turn some kind of individual experience into collective?
Yes, that's how I understand that question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that from individual experience, you know, there are a lot of individual experiences, but I'm sure that each of individual experiences, you know, it's not me, it's not myself alone who are feeling lonely or do not want to be left alone at home and far away from my family. like kind of things. So I think it's not only me. There are a lot of people feeling that in this kind of situations, and I think that although it is individual experiences, but since a lot of people experience the same way, then I think we can make it into collective.
Okay, and the last, we have the last two questions. I have one more here and one in Zoom. So then it might seem way too complicated matter to look for a protagonist, but this is not just destroying the solidarity.
Yes, I know. So solidarity itself, like Noemi already said about vulnerability. I think that vulnerability is also epistemological. People can be vulnerable in a different way. So I think yes, to choose who will be the protagonist, it will be a hard task. I mean, there will be some people who think that, oh my God, I feel pain. I feel this kind of pain. I feel this. But since again, I told you that it is an opening, a social arena. So I think we need to push it to find the best way to prepare a mental state. So in order to find a best way to prepare a mental state for next generation, so we need to clearly find who is the protagonist. I know it will be hard, but I'm sure we can do it.
Okay, and last quick question from Alican. I think I gave you already permission to speak, so.
Yes, thank you. Fitrilya, thank you. I really appreciate the effort of overcoming the crisis by already pushing it behind in a way, and that made me think of monuments, because some monuments can be a way to really put symbolically a trauma into the collective urban space, and made me think of the Berlin Memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe by Peter Eisenman, and that space is somehow a neutral space where if let's say a kid wanders in it, that kid doesn't really know the past. There's no direct explanation of what the Holocaust was, unless you go underground and reach the gallery. And so I was thinking, what kind of monument would be for this COVID pandemic? And I mean, it's a very open question, right? It's just thinking about it that I think your thinking brings that in a way, and I find that interesting. So imagine a public place having just this one room where you can enter and just to remind us of this time we collectively went through, and something like that about loneliness, right? The trauma of this is based on being isolated, and it could be interesting to have in the middle of a city like a single room, in every city to have a single room where you just enter and sit for a minute to remember these few months, and hopefully they don't last way longer, where we can overcome this or something. Anyway, thank you, Fitrilya.
Yeah, thank you, Alican. Well, about monument itself, I want to I want to share something. What I have read in New York Times, but I forgot the date. But it is, in those editions of New York Times, it published names of people who died after COVID-19 and what their roles in society, some sort. Yeah, I guess monument is the best idea to turn collective trauma into cultural trauma. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will not have time for any more questions, as in around 11 minutes we'll be starting the next panel. So I would like to thank you so much for everybody that was present in the first panel. Thank you for very interesting conversations and also questions.